All right, good evening, cowboys, cowgirls, and outlaws. We are going to be doing our episode 101 on the Second Amendment. And specifically, what we are going to be talking about in this episode today, this podcast, is we are going to be talking about specifically the language of the Second Amendment. And we are going to go through the words as in a context of what they really mean so that you can get a better understanding of exactly what these words mean when you read them over. I may state my opinion of the Second Amendment as far as the language is concerned, but once again, this episode is only about studying what those words mean in the context in which they are written, and I will do the best I can to explain that. A lot of the information that I'm going to be giving you can be found on the actual Constitutional Center website, constitution.gov, and also there's a number of other articles that have to do with what actual constitutional members of the Constitutional Center actually say that they mean, as well as actually digging into some United States code and also obviously some Supreme Court cases, which we will cover in later episodes. But with that being said, let me first say that the Second Amendment itself is written in such a way that can sometimes be misconstrued by one side or the other. And obviously, if it weren't, we really wouldn't be having kind of some of the issues that we have today and the Supreme Court cases that have had to rule in certain ways to define exactly what that amendment really says. So I want you to kind of keep that in mind, and let's just kind of say this out there. There are just some portions of the Constitution, and we'll get into this in a later episode, but there are some portions of the Constitution that are written with the idea of compromise. In fact, quite a bit of the document is a compromise to essentially establish a federal government, which is what part of the Constitution does, and it also establishes the fact or acknowledges the fact that there are natural rights that are given to citizens and people of the state or part of the federal government or all that stuff. Anyway, let's get into the words right now, and let's go ahead and we can have a discourse in the comment section of this video. I am welcome to all opinions. I will try to respond to them, but let's go ahead and jump right into it. So first, let me read the Second Amendment as it is written currently. It says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Now, let's just, without going into the words right now, I just want to say that there are different versions of the Second Amendment. When the Constitution was written, there were many different drafts that were proposed. I can't tell you exactly how many drafts. However, the final draft of what you see and what I just said may or may not have been the actual right that was specifically explained as it is today. So just keep that in mind, that when the framers wrote the Constitution, they did several drafts of different rights, and the Second Amendment is no exception to that. So what does this part mean? Well-regulated. According to some articles that I've read, and according to my own interpretation, as well as what the Constitutional Center says, is that it basically means it is well organized, it is well armed, disciplined, and able-bodied. We'll get into what able-bodied means here in a second, but it can also mean that it is activating, training, or deploying. What some people think it means is that it is regulated to the effect of whoever can join. It is regulated to the effect of people join at the discretion of the regulating body, meaning there are certain people that do not fit within the militia, therefore they are not allowed to serve in the militia. that's something that kind of gets taken into consideration. But for all intents and purposes, it really means able-bodied individuals. So what is a militia? Well, first off, a militia is, by definition, it is a non-professional fighting force, and it is made up typically of civilians, and in our case, it is a citizen army in which the people, or the American people, make up that militia. They are typically associated with having very limited training, but they can be used for emergency services and, if necessary, defense or military operations. There was a specific tactic that was utilized by many countries of the time prior to the Constitution, as well as during the eras of the Constitution being written, in which militias had a very key role in tactics of the day that were mainly incorporated within the regular army, or the regular military, or the professional soldiers. So it's just kind of interesting to note that, but for all intents and purposes, a militia is a non-professional fighting force that is typically organized by citizens. So let's just go ahead and call it that. It is a citizen army. Very, very explanatory there. But let's also, it's kind of interesting to note that even now, under Title 10, Chapter 12 of the United States Code, specifically under the chapter that says Organization and General Military Powers, it states that there are actually two types of militias, and it does actually acknowledge a militia. I think that's kind of interesting, and that's something that we have to take into account. So what are these two militias? And even though this is not specifically the language of the Second Amendment, nonetheless, militia is a word that is utilized, and it's important for us to understand in full context what a militia meant back then and what it means now. So, under the current code, it states that there are two militias, an organized and an unorganized militia. Organized militia is pertaining to personnel that are actually part of the National Guard or the Naval Militia. An unorganized militia is an individual or member that is not part of the National Guard or Naval Militia, and it typically consists of males 17 to 45 years old and females who are part of the National Guard. So, and I may have gotten that slightly confused here, but an organized militia has males and females 17 to 45 who are actively involved in the National Guard, whereas the unorganized militia typically pertains to males only, at least in the current language that it is written, 17 to 45 years old, and they are not part of the National Guard or the militia. Just something that is kind of interesting to note, that it is specifically written in that way. So, moving on, what does security mean? Well, you have to take it back in the context of the day. There's several versions of security, but in the context of the framers of the Constitution, we're talking about being protected from invasion, whether that be from Indians or England or any other foreign power. And it's also talking about being protected from tyranny or government overreach. So when you say security and you read that word, those are the two things that you kind of need to think of. It's kind of two-ended there. When we're talking about a state, the security of a free state, it's self-explanatory. It specifically is referring to what the states were after the 13 original colonies, what was formed under the Articles of Confederation, in which the states were actually considered their own country. Under the Constitution, that would no longer be the case. However, when we talk about state, we are talking about the individual states. So, New Jersey would have its militia, Virginia would have its militia, Georgia would have its militia, and the United States would just have the opportunity to call up those militias from those specific states. So when you hear the word state, they are talking about the individual state. Okay, and the reason why that is the word utilized to explain that, and where we get that from, can be seen from the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1777, which was primarily used in this particular case. This meaning of state was particularly derived from when James Madison wrote the Constitution. So what is a right? Okay, so we talk about, the right of the people. This is kind of interesting in the fact that a right back then, and we can see evidence of this, especially in documents like the Declaration of Independence, in which we have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, typically in the manner of which it is God-given or naturally given. Regardless of whether you think that the Constitution framers were deists or religious, it's obvious that they understood that rights were inherent. They weren't necessarily something that was just provided to by a governing body. It is something that you are born with. So it's an inherent natural right that you have. So we see this evidence once again in documents like the Declaration of Independence, which was drafted by Thomas Jefferson and a few other members as well. Thomas Jefferson was basically the one who wrote it. I'm kind of getting off track here, but in there he explains we have a natural right, that in this case talks about what we are born with. So that is what it means when we talk about what is a right. So the right of the people. It's something that is inherent, that is given by nature, and that we all have a right regardless of whether a government says we do or not. So that's just something that you have to consider when you read it. The next word we should focus on is people. Okay, so the right of the people to keep and bear arms. When we talk about the people, what are we talking about? First off, I want to say that the word people is semantically broad. It is not very specific. It does not talk about women, slaves, or anything like that, even though people like that back in the day were considered more property than they were actually individuals. However, what we do know is that we know that the people generally, and the legal consensus of what people means back then and now, means essentially individuals. So whether those individuals are free or slave, you can still associate individuals. We have an individual right. Okay, so that's what that essentially comes down to. Another theory is that it talks about those who are only allowed to vote. But once again, semantics is everything. Even the Second Amendment is no exception. Is that it refers to all individuals. Okay, so with that being said, just understand it's all individuals. Keep and bear. Keep means to possess or own by definition. Okay. To bear means to have on your person or to be carried by some other means. So you can own, you can possess, you can carry, you can have on your person. That's what it means. That's what it meant back then. That's what it means now. Arms. This is something that kind of gets confused a lot, and I'm not going to get into more of the specifics of what the left or the right says, but what I am going to say is that when we talk about arms, we are talking about weapons that are in common use. Take that how you mean it. We will go into a further discussion later on in another episode in which we will actually explain what types of arms are allowed under the Second Amendment. However, in this particular case, arms as the word means weapons in common use. It doesn't say for the day, it just says common use. Okay? Shall not be infringed. Shall not be interfered with, violated, or removed. So there you have it. That's essentially what our Second Amendment broken down really means in context of the day, back then, and also how it can be taken now, because that's the way it was written. It was meant to be fluid so that it could translate into the future. Thank you very much. I hope to see you guys in the next episode. I'll let you know what we're covering then.